In early 1900s Berlin, crowds gathered to see a horse do something that should have been impossible. Ask him 2 plus 3 and he would tap his hoof 5 times. Ask him to count objects and somehow he seemed to get that right too. His name was Clever Hans, and people claimed he could do far more than simple counting. Fractions, dates, telling the time, even answering questions through a kind of coded alphabet. Naturally, plenty of people suspected a trick, so in 1904, a commission including scientists, teachers, military officers, a veterinarian, and even a circus manager came to investigate. They looked for secret signals, they looked for obvious training tricks, they looked for fraud, and they couldn't find it. So, if Hans wasn't simply being told when to stop tapping, what exactly was his horse doing? Hans belonged to Wilhelm von Osten, a retired mathematics teacher in Germany. Von Osten believed animals were capable of far more than most people realised, and instead of treating Hans like a circus act, he seems to have treated him more like a pupil. There were lessons, questions, repetition, and of course rewards. Bread, carrots, and sometimes sugar. Hans learned to answer mainly by tapping with his right front hoof. 1 tap meant 1, 2 meant 2, 5 meant 5. For 0, he could shake his head. Von Osten then built more and more complicated questions around that system. Letters could be turned into numbers. Numbers could represent words. And after years of training, Hans appeared to be doing something remarkable. These weren't secret demonstrations either. People could come and watch him in a Berlin courtyard. There was no admission fee, and spectators could stand close enough to see what was going on, which created a problem for anyone hoping to dismiss the whole thing as an obvious stage trick, because plenty of people were watching and nobody could quite explain it. Counting was only the beginning. Hans could apparently count people, hats, umbrellas, even windows on buildings. Then came arithmetic, addition, subtraction, multiplication, division. Some of the recorded examples became surprisingly complicated. Ask Hans for the factor of 28 and he could supposedly tap out 2, 4, 7, 14, 28. He was even given fractions. In one recorded example, Hans was asked to work out 2/5 plus 1/2. His answer was 9/10. 9 taps for the top number, 10 for the bottom. And somehow, maths still wasn't the end of it. Hans was also said to recognise written words, identify musical notes, tell the time, work with calendar dates, and recognise different people. The story spread. Newspapers wrote about him. Postcards were made. Scientists, horse experts, and curious members of the public came to see him for themselves. Some walked away convinced they had just watched a horse reason through a problem. Others thought the explanation was much simpler. Von Osten must be giving him signals. Maybe it was a movement, a sound, a change in posture, something telling Hans, stop tapping now. So eventually, that theory was put to the test. In 1904, a group was assembled to investigate Hans properly. It became known as the Hans Commission, and the members weren't all academics. That was part of the point. The group included teachers, scientists, military officers, a veterinarian, the director of the Berlin Zoological Garden, and a circus manager. Someone who knew exactly what trained animal tricks could look like. The commission watched Hans under different conditions. Other people questioned him. Van Osten wasn't always present. They looked for hidden signals and familiar training methods. And when the investigation finished, they reached a unanimous conclusion. They couldn't find evidence that Hans was being deliberately fed the answers through the usual tricks. That didn't prove the horse understood arithmetic, but it did remove the easiest explanation. They hadn't caught Von Osten cheating. And Hans could sometimes perform for people other than his owner. So instead of closing the case, they opened it wider. A more controlled investigation was needed, and that job eventually fell to a young researcher named Oskar Pfungst. He started asking a different question. Not, can Hans get the answer right, but what has to happen before Hans gets it right? That changed everything. Pfungst began altering one part of the demonstration at a time. Sometimes von Osten asked the questions. Sometimes somebody else did. Sometimes Hans could see the questioner clearly. Sometimes his view was blocked. And then Pfungst changed something that sounds almost ridiculously simple. Sometimes the person asking the question knew the correct answer. Sometimes they didn't. Imagine Hans is shown a card with a number on it. Hans can see the card. The person questioning him cannot. If Hans really understands what he's looking at, that shouldn't make any difference. The horse knows the number. The human doesn't need to. But it made a huge difference. When the questioner knew the answer, Hans was extremely accurate. When they didn't, his performance fell apart. Now they had something. The problem wasn't the question. It wasn't who owned the horse. It wasn't even necessarily who was asking. Somehow, Hans's success depended on whether the human standing in front of him already knew what the answer should be. And that led to the experiment that finally cracked the case. Pfungst tested Hans with written numbers the horse could see, but the questioner could not. When the questioner knew what answer Hans was supposed to give, he was correct in about 98% of the trials. When the questioner didn't know, accuracy dropped to around 8%. Then Pfungst tried blocking Hans's view of the person asking the question. When Hans could see them, he was right about 89% of the time. When he definitely couldn't, he got just 2 out of 35 trials correct, about 6%. That was the breakthrough. Hans didn't just need the question, he needed to see somebody who already knew the answer. The information was somehow coming from the person, but there was still a problem. Nobody appeared to be giving him a signal. There was no word, no hand gesture, no secret command, and in many cases, the people questioning Hans genuinely believed they were doing absolutely nothing. Pfungst eventually realised they were correct, at least consciously. The signal was happening without them knowing it. Imagine asking Hans, what is 2 plus 3? You already know the answer is 5. Hans starts tapping 1, 2, 3, 4, and as he gets closer, you're waiting for him to reach 5. Without noticing it, your body may change slightly. You lean, you tense, your head moves. Then Hans taps 5. At the moment he reaches the answer, you relax. Maybe your head rises slightly. Maybe your posture changes. It might be almost invisible, but Hans had learned to notice it. Pfungst found that people tended to make tiny movements as Hans approached the number they were expecting, followed by another small change when he reached it. To Hans, that meant one thing: stop. And some of those movements were incredibly small. Pfungst estimated that certain movements made by von Osten may have been no more than around 1/5 of a millimetre, yet Hans was sensitive enough to respond. Pfungst eventually got so good at recognising the pattern that he could control the horse's answers himself. He could decide in advance when he wanted Hans to stop and produce the movement that made it happen. At that point, the mystery was effectively solved. Hans wasn't working out the answer, he was watching the person who already knew it. So Hans couldn't do arithmetic, but calling him stupid misses the best part of the story. For years, he'd been rewarded whenever he'd stopped tapping at the right moment, and somewhere along the way, he learned something von Osten never meant to teach him. He didn't need to understand the question, he needed to understand the person asking it. That is a very different skill, and apparently Hans became extraordinarily good at it, good enough to notice movements that experienced human observers struggled to see, good enough to fool scientists, spectators, and his own owner. And importantly, the evidence doesn't suggest von Osten spent years running some elaborate scam. He seems to have genuinely believed Hans could solve the problems. The signals worked because von Osten wasn't deliberately giving them. Hans has simply learned to read something his teacher didn't even realise he was saying. The case became so famous that psychology still uses the term clever Hans effect for situations where someone or something appears to understand a task but is actually responding to unintended cues from the person conducting the test. So the real story isn't that a horse fooled everyone by pretending to do maths. It's stranger than that. A man tried to teach a horse arithmetic and accidentally taught him to read humans instead. And before we close the file, if you enjoy these strange animal cases where the explanation turns out to be even more interesting than the claim, give the video a like. It helps more people find the channel. So, could clever Hans really do maths? Let's close the file. Hans could perform arithmetic. Busted. Once the person asking the question didn't know the answer, Hans's success rate collapsed. Deliberate fraud? Busted. Investigators found no convincing evidence that von Osten was knowingly feeding Hans the answers. Hans read human cues? Confirmed. His performance depended heavily on seeing someone who already knew the answer, and Pfungst eventually learned to reproduce those signals himself. Hans couldn't calculate 2 plus 3, but he had learned something else. He knew what a human looked like when they were waiting for 5. And for a horse that couldn't do maths, clever Hans was still pretty clever. And if you think a horse doing maths sounds strange, wait until you hear about the rats that were actually given a lawyer. That case is on screen now. And subscribe to see more strange animal cases.